Welcome to Dead Souls Social Club.
This audio presentation contains graphic details of death, violence, and controversial subject matter. Listener discretion is strongly advised. From Dead Souls Media, this is Ed Gein, The True Story. I'm Jamie Black, a researcher and psychologist, and I'll be your host for tonight. So, last week, Netflix dropped their new true crime drama titled Monster, the Ed Gein story. It's the third such series after Netflix previously created similar productions about Jeffrey Dahmer and the Menendez brothers. Being someone who likes to dabble in true crime, shall we say, I watched the first two series. But I was struck by the numerous inaccuracies in both, shall we say. Now, whilst I appreciate that the goal of television drama is to make an interesting and entertaining watch first and foremost, I think it's always more interesting to be armed with all of the correct facts when you're watching too, as sometimes real life can be stranger than fiction. Additionally, these three series, and also the upcoming fourth series, which is currently in production, and about the 1892 axe murders of Lizzie Borden's parents, are all produced by Ryan Murphy. If you don't know Murphy's work, well, he's the creator of such shows as American Horror Story, Glee, Ratched, Scream Queens, The Watcher, and the American Crime Story anthology series. Murphy is known, controversially at times, to glamorize, sexualize, and fetishize his true-life criminal characters whom he portrays. And thus, the lens for which he tells his stories, whilst coveted in the quote-unquote "this is a true story" disclaimer, are often not genuine portrayals of true-life events or said characters. Now, I could go into detail about how the Menendez brothers were portrayed as questionable incestuous siblings with a Leopold and Loeb complex, or how Jeffrey Dahmer was portrayed as a brooding and chiseled hunk. But of course, neither of these character elements were true in real life. The Guardian's Richard Lawson has called the latest installment in the Monster franchise about Ed Gein as, quote, monstrous. The Ed Gein series is a lurid exploitation dressed up as a serious drama. Now, a friend of mine said to me last week after watching the Ed Gein series, quote, I actually feel sorry for Ed Gein. It wasn't his fault. His behaviours were created and developed because of his bizarre upbringing, an obsessive mother. Now, whilst this is true, it's important to note that all serial killers, hell, all criminals, develop their behaviours due to lifetime experience and trauma. Gein is no different to any other criminal in that respect. But the trauma they have experienced does not excuse monstrous behaviours or mindless depravity. So let's keep that in perspective, if nothing else. So with all of these tidbits in mind, I just wanted to present the Ed Gein story and all of their facts in a laid-bare telling with no sensationalism. This is the true story of Ed Gein, the so-called Butcher of Plainfield.
To see one of the well-known people in Plainfield, well-liked person in Plainfield, hanging there, upside down and dressed out like a deer, it's hard to explain how a man feels when he sees something like that.
The butchered remains of a woman named Bernice Warden were just the beginning. Deputies now journeyed into the private lair of Ed Gein. The farm had no electricity. They were entering a dark sanctuary of madness and horror.
You likely don't need any introduction to names like Norman Bates, the killer from Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, Buffalo Bill, the serial killer being hunted in The Silence of the Lambs, or Leatherface, the psychotic and deranged killer from Tobe Hooper's Texas Chainsaw Massacre. All three claim solid and well-deserved places in the Horror Hall of Fame. But did you know they were all based on one real person? Elements of all three of these characters were taken from a real-life serial killer. He was considered one of the most despicable human beings that committed monstrous and sickening acts against his fellow humans. Edward Theodore Gein. Infamous, wretched, and depraved. And although none of them directly reflect every aspect of Gein's persona or crimes, they do each portray elements of Gein's nature and personality, and the shocking way that he committed his crimes. Let's take a dive into the real American Psycho. Let's try to understand what drove a quiet and rather soft small-town mother's boy to commit some of the most gruesome crimes ever committed. And let's discuss the true story of the so-called grandfather of gore. I suppose the root cause of Gein's actions lie with his parents. His father, George, had a difficult life. He was orphaned at the age of just 3 after his mother, father and older sister were swept away to their deaths in a flash flood. George was brought up by his maternal grandparents and grew up with low self-esteem, becoming heavily dependent on alcohol as he drifted through life. However, things changed for him when he met Ed's mother, Augusta, a fierce, stocky woman who was fanatically religious and obsessively outraged by the loose morality of the world around her. George and Augusta married on December the 4th, 1899. Their marriage was not what you might call perfect, however. Augusta dominated the weak and unreliable George, and it wasn't long before his life became miserable with her. This resulted in George's reliance on alcohol, which in turn regularly resulted in violence between the married couple. But despite this loveless marriage, Augusta still gave birth to their first child on January the 17th, 1902. The baby was a boy, which they named Henry. Augusta did not bond with Henry at all, however, and because of this Augusta longed for another child in the hope that it would be a girl. She fell pregnant again 3 years later, praying nightly for the Lord to bless her with a baby girl so that she could raise her in her own image. On October the 27th, 1906, Augusta gave birth to Edward Theodore Gein in Lacoste County, Wisconsin. Another boy. Augusta felt betrayed by God and dismayed, but would, at the very least, embrace this child, and also vow that the baby, young Ed, would not grow up like, quote, the usual lustful, foul-mouthed males who used women for their own perverted pleasures. Augusta's own words. She was thus adamant that her dear Ed would be different to all the other boys. In Ed's early life, his mother and father owned and ran a local grocery store, which they later sold and briefly moved to a small dairy farm near Camp Douglas, Illinois, before the family made the permanent move to a farm in the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin. Augusta Gein was extremely house-proud and maintained a well-ordered and completely pristine household. The Gein farm was also remote, very rural in fact, and it was due to this secluded location that she could keep both herself and her sons away from what she called the scandalous, low moral standards of the Plainfield townsfolk. As a Lutheran, Augusta took it upon herself to take care of her son's religious and moral education. Ed and his brother Henry only left the farm to go to standard school. The rest of the time, they were kept isolated from all other children, miles from town, with only each other and their mother for company. Neither of the boys fit in with their peers or within their small town. But regardless, any attempt that they made to make friends was soon objected to by Augusta, who would be appalled that they could associate with such common people. Again, her views and words. Ed would have a miserable time whilst at school. He was frequently bullied, particularly targeted because of his droopy eye, lopsided grin, and somewhat effeminate manner. Ed would quickly become an easy target for abuse. His home life was equally miserable. Ed's father would regularly beat him in all too frequent drunken rages, whilst his mother would all the while rant about morality. To add to these woes, the Gein farm was failing. Making ends meet was becoming more and more of a struggle for the family, and Ed was retreating more and more into his own private little fantasy world. Later in life, and once adults, Henry and Ed would take odd jobs around the town of Plainfield in addition to working on the family farm. But life was tough. Both men were hard-working, reliable and trustworthy individuals, and the pair were generally well liked at this stage in their lives. But their father's acute alcoholism was taking its toll, however, and by 1937 he was a broken man. He was unable to care for himself and would become entirely reliant upon his wife and children to look after him. A wife and 2 children who all completely loathed him. George wouldn't be released from this reliance and despair until 1940, some 3 years later, when on April the 1st of that year, April Fool's Day, he would succumb to heart failure. His loss was seemingly not mourned by his wife or sons. On the contrary, in fact, they were relieved that they didn't have to look after him anymore. At the time of George's death, the Second World War was in full swing in the European theatre, and the Pacific War was to follow a short while later. But neither of the Gein brothers would be involved. Henry was too old, and Ed's droopy eye meant that he did not pass the physical exam due to impaired vision. Despite this, the brothers started to get more and more work outside of the farm in the absence of many men who had gone off to war, and Henry in particular had a good reputation for being a hard grafter. Ed would often be hired to babysit for local families, and the children seemed to love his company. The 2 brothers generally had a good relationship, although there was some animosity between them regarding how close Ed was to their mother. Henry was slightly jealous of their extremely close bond, but this would develop into concern, with Henry on several occasions questioning the hold that their mother had over Ed. Henry was concerned that they were a little too close. These remarks shocked Ed, as he couldn't believe that his brother did not share his view of their mother, and how much of a perfect human being he regarded her, and as a saint on this earth. The criticism from Henry of their mother affected Ed, and his opinion of his older brother declined as a result. Henry died suddenly on May 16, 1944, at the age of just 43. It was surprisingly young, even at that time. Now, there are some mixed stories and viewpoints regarding Henry's death. The story goes that Henry and Ed had been fighting a fire on marshland near their farm. There was somewhat of a dispute on how the blaze started, with some claiming that it was accidental, whilst others saying that Gein started it to burn off some dry grass. Although after Henry's death, Ed would declare that it was his brother who started the fire. It's difficult to know for sure. Ed claimed that a gust of wind grew the fire to out-of-control proportions, and as the 2 brothers tried to extinguish the flames, Henry went missing. Ed went for help, and a search party was sent out. However, inexplicably, as soon as they arrived, Ed led the searchers straight to his brother's corpse, as if he knew exactly where he lay dead. Henry was found laying face down and stretched out with no apparent signs of burns. But what was observed was some strange bruising to his head. Despite this, the official cause of death was asphyxiation, due to being overcome by the smoke and thus falling and hitting his head. At the time of Henry's death, no foul play was suspected, and it was only some years later that it was realized that Henry may well have been Ed's first murdered victim. Similarly to the passing of his father, there was no outpouring of grief from Ed or Augusta, and it meant that Ed finally had his beloved mother all to himself. This is because Ed, adored her. She was the backbone of his life, and she had always kept everything going, both inside and out. The family farm, for example. To Ed, she was invincible. So when she suddenly became unwell, it came as a huge shock to him. Ed dutifully rushed her to hospital in his pickup truck, where it was confirmed that she had suffered a massive stroke. Ed stayed at her bedside in the hospital for hours on end in the hope that she would recover. Eventually she would be discharged, but she was not the same formidable strength that she used to be, and Ed had to give her 24/7 around-the-clock care, catering to her every need and making her his sole focus. It's thought that seeing his mother in this helpless state gave him a strange sense of exhilaration. He thought it was a chance to prove to her that he was a dutiful son, and perhaps for her to show him more affection. However, this would not be the case, because although Augusta did make a reasonable recovery, she did not show the son who devoted on her 1 ounce of appreciation for the care that he had given her. She took Ed for granted. But thanks to Ed's care, his now healthy mother was quickly back on the warpath, so to speak, and in the winter of 1945, she accompanied Ed to a nearby farm to collect some straw. Whilst this might seem a fairly insignificant occurrence in the life of Ed and Augusta Gein, it was actually a tipping point. As the Geins drove into the farmyard, the farmer, named Smith, and another female were having a furious argument. The argument was because the female had witnessed Smith beating a puppy to death. Ed would later recall that his mother had witnessed Smith beating the dog. Then when a woman from inside the Smith residence had come outside and screamed for Smith to stop the abuse, it was then that Smith killed the puppy in front of them both. Augusta was extremely upset. But she was not upset because of the brutality towards the puppy, but rather because of the presence of the other woman. Augusta later told Ed that the woman was not married to Smith, and thus she had no business being at the Smith residence. Augusta angrily referred to her as, quote, Smith's harlot. The incident would upset her so much, in fact, that less than a week later, Augusta Gein suffered another catastrophic stroke. Augusta did not survive this time, and on December the 29th, 1945, at the age of 67, Augusta Gein was dead. Ed was all alone at her funeral. He cried uncontrollably and was unable to control his grief. Ed had lost the only thing in his life that he loved. He was devastated, distraught, lost, and broken with grief. But this was a clear psychological catalyst, because following Augusta's death, Ed would spend the rest of his life trying to replicate his mother in the most horrific ways imaginable. Those who lived in the tight-knit community of Plainfield could see little change in Ed initially, apart from him looking slightly more unkempt and run down than usual, of course. He was still the polite, friendly, slightly awkward, but helpful guy that had always been known to them. They knew Ed was unique and accepted him that way. By today's standards, we may consider him neurodiverse. Few could ever realize, however, what madness was quietly festering within Ed's brain. Many of the locals felt sorry for Ed, who was living his solitary bachelor life in the now run-down farm, although some of the local women had said they felt a little uneasy around him, as he had a tendency to stare at them with his droopy eyelid and lopsided smirk. He also became the target for many practical jokes from the local farmers that he helped, but who sadly also considered him the perfect target to pick on. Ed also had a tendency to laugh and chuckle to himself, clearly amusing himself in his own mind, but this was something that unnerved many people around him. Back at his farmhouse, Ed boarded up rooms used by his mother, including the upstairs, downstairs parlour and living room, leaving them untouched for years, while the rest of the house became increasingly filthy. The boarded-up rooms remained pristine, but as the years passed, Ed retreated more and more from society, spending hours alone, reading his true crime magazines, articles about cannibalism, grave robbing, and sexual mutilation. Gein would live in a small room next to his kitchen, and it was around this time that he took particular interest in Nazi atrocities, specifically concerning the atrocities committed by Ilse Koch, who had been accused of selecting tattooed prisoners for death to fashion lampshades and other items of furniture from their skin. It was only occasionally that Ed ventured outside, to conduct an odd job or collect some supplies, although he was known to frequent Mary Hogan's Tavern, a place that was over 7 miles from his home. The reason for this was his fixation with the owner, who bore a striking resemblance to his own dead mother. For poor old Ed, his life was painfully empty without Augusta, and his growing resentment of the villagers who teased him was reaching boiling point. Then, one afternoon in May of 1947, a young girl named Georgia Weckler went missing. She was dropped off by a neighbour near her Fort Atkinson home, but she was never seen again. It was May the 1st, May Day, the first day of summer. She was just 8 years old when she disappeared, and there was speculation in the town that she had been snatched by a, quote, person of a deviant mind. Over the next 5 years, there were 4 more unexplained disappearances in Wisconsin. These included 14-year-old babysitter Evelyn Hartley, whose heavily blood-stained clothing was found, but her body was not. Then there was Plainfield resident Victor Travis, a 42-year-old farmer, and a friend of his named Raymond Burgess. Travis, who was a resident of nearby Adams County, went out to hunt for deer with his friend Ray on November 1st, 1952. In the late afternoon, they both stopped by Mac's Bar in Plainfield for a few hours. But at around 7 p.m, they both got into Ray's car and drove away. The hunters, along with Ray's car, were never seen again, and no trace of them was ever found. Vic Travis and Ray Burgess had been hunting on the property next to Ed Gein's farm, even though Gein had strongly objected to them utilising the property for hunting on the day that they disappeared. However, it was the disappearance of tavern owner Mary Hogan on December the 8th, 1954 that really baffled the local police. All they found on the floor of the tavern that Hogan owned was a pool of blood and a spent .32 caliber cartridge, but there was no sign of Hogan. Despite appeals, searches, and significant community action, a year on from her disappearance, the police still had no clue or any leads about what had happened to her. In the years that followed Mary's disappearance, the locals often talked about Hogan, and on the rare occasion that Ed made an appearance in the town, locals recalled him making the same joke about her over and over. "She's not missing," he would say. "She's just down on the farm." Bear in mind that Ed had a reputation in the town of being somewhat of an oddball, so no one really took any notice of this rather bizarre joke. Until of course they did. But strange rumours started circulating around the town of Plainfield. They were started by local teenagers who had snuck onto Ed's property and then visited his rundown farmhouse. They made claims that they had seen shrunken human heads in his house. In fact, Ed himself told the young teens that the heads had been sent to him by his cousin who had fought in the Philippines during the Second World War. No one thought much about it initially, just thinking it would be typical for Ed to collect such macabre and weird souvenirs. By all accounts, it actually became a running joke with the locals. Strange old Ed, his strange old ways, and his strange old habits. But then on November the 16th, 1957, a large amount of the males from Plainfield were participating in the town's annual 9-day deer hunting event. Whilst most of the local men took part, Ed certainly did not. Now, with the locals out of the way and all tied up with the town event, Ed ventured into the town and paid a visit to Warren's hardware store that was run by 58-year-old widow Bernice Warden. Ed knew very well that the heavily built Warden would be alone. Gein purchased a gallon of antifreeze initially, but he later returned to the shop on the pretense that he wanted to trade in his rifle. It was upon his return that Ed Gein shot Bernice dead. Later that day at around 5 p.m, Bernice's son Frank, who just happened to be the deputy sheriff in the town, came home from the hunt and discovered the blood-splattered shop with the cash register wide open and realized that something terrible had occurred. When further police officers arrived, the deeply destroyed Frank immediately told police, quote, "He's done something to her." When the officers inquired who had done something to his mother, Frank replied, "Eddie G." Frank suspected Gein because a sales slip for the antifreeze made out to Gein was the last receipt written by Bernice Warden on the morning that she disappeared. The revelation caused a rush of activity in Plainfield as law enforcement officers converged on the town with one goal in mind: to locate Bernice Warden and bring Gein in for questioning. After calling at Gein's farm, they soon realized that Ed wasn't there, so they made their way to the nearby Hills residence, a place that Gein was known to frequent, and they were right. Ed was there helping the Hills install a car battery. He had stayed for dinner with the family and was just about to set off in his car with one of Hill's sons. After asking Gein just a few short questions, police officers knew that they had their man. The sheriff in charge of investigating Mrs. Warden's disappearance was Arthur Schley. He was aware that Gein had been apprehended, and so, accompanied by Captain Shoesfester, the two men headed out to Gein's farm to see if they could find anything that linked to Bernice Warden's disappearance. As the officers approached the squalid farmhouse, they could never have prepared themselves for what they would discover. As they entered the property, shining their flashlights across the junk-ridden rooms, Schley felt something graze against him. As he turned around to see what it was, he could see something hanging by its feet. It had been slit down the middle, gutted like an animal, and had its head removed. But it wasn't an animal. It was the mutilated and decapitated body of a female human. It was Bernice Warden. The hanging corpse was, to quote Sheriff Schley, dressed out like a deer. The officers could hardly believe what they were seeing. Schley and Shoefester fled the house, with Schley falling to his knees in the snow outside, throwing up. Shoefester immediately radioed for backup. The two men reluctantly and slowly then re-entered the house. The smell was putrid, the filth overwhelming, and the stench of death was all around them. It was difficult to believe that any human could live in such squalor. But they hadn't seen the half of it yet. What they found was, without a doubt, a true house of horrors. As per the later made public police report, in total the authorities found whole human bones and fragments, a wastebasket made from human skin covering several chairs, human skulls mounted on bedposts, female skulls, some with the tops sawn off, bowls made from human skulls, a corset made from a female torso skinned from shoulders to waist, leggings made from human leg skin, masks made from the skin of female heads, Mary Hogan's face mask in a paper bag, Mary Hogan's skull in a box, Bernice Warden's entire head in a burlap sack, Bernice Warden's heart in a plastic bag in front of Gein's potbelly stove. 9 vulvas in a shoebox. A young girl's dress and the vulvas of 2 females judged to have been about 15 years old. A belt made from female human nipples. 4 noses. A pair of lips on a window shade drawstring. And a lampshade made from the skin of a human face. Bernice Warden's still warm entrails were wrapped in newspaper, steam still rising from it. In fact, so many body parts were discovered, it was impossible to determine how many victims there were, although it was apparent that there were an array of bones, skin, flesh, breasts, genitals, noses, heads and lips belonging to multiple females. All of these horrific bits and pieces were found in the confined area that Ed lived in within the house, the room in which he dwelled, namely the kitchen and a downstairs bedroom. The other parts of the house, as I previously mentioned, had been boarded up, and it was with some dread that officers removed these boards, terrified of what they would find behind them. But it wasn't what they were expecting. It was the untouched rooms of Augusta Gein, in the exact same state that she left them years before. Everything was in perfect order. All her clothes and possessions had been sealed up and untouched since the day that she died. Gein was locked up in a jailhouse close to where Sheriff Schley and his family lived. Ed was not making any confessions during questioning initially, and the sheriff became increasingly frustrated with him, lashing out and slamming his head against the jail wall trying to beat a confession out of him. This ultimately seemed to have the opposite effect on Ed though, and he completely clammed up under the pressure. Meanwhile, back in Plainfield, speculation and gossip was rife, and the town was overrun with reporters from the length and breadth of the country. Gruesome headlines started to appear in the press immediately. In the following days, Gein confessed to the murder of Bernice Warden. He also made another astonishing confession. When asked where all the body parts had come from, Ed admitted that over a 5-year period beginning in 1947, he had been a regular night visitor to cemeteries in the area, and on at least 9 occasions had dug up freshly buried coffins, removed the bodies, and then reburied the caskets. Gein chose his fresh corpses by trawling the obituaries in the local newspapers and selecting middle-aged women as his victims. He admitted that some of the women he had known in life. Ed claimed the details of his grave robbing were hazy in his memory. The press were eager to publish the lurid details of Gein's crimes and how he was a depraved, sex-crazed cannibal. There was also speculation that he had been responsible for the disappearance of other Wisconsin residents, in particular teenager Evelyn Hartley. In fact, the press were eager to pin every unsolved disappearance in recent years on Gein. The press were also bizarrely given access to Gein's house by police officers, and this is why so many macabre photographs of the crime scene are available today. As more and more details of what Ed had done emerged, the headlines in the press got more and more grotesque, and many tales of encounters with Ed started to surface. One local spinster even claimed to have been Ed Gein's secret sweetheart for the past 20 years. But this was a claim that was later retracted during police interrogation. Plus, we all know there was only one woman in Ed's life. Following a lie detector test, Gein would admit to some of the more perverse things that he did with the body parts. But he was less forthcoming when it came to discussing the murders which he had committed, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. But Ed would openly discuss his grave-robbing exploits, admitting that he would often dig up a body and just cut off the parts that he wanted, usually the head and genitals. Then he would rebury the body as if nothing had happened. In Ed's mind, as the victims were already dead, he saw this as a lesser crime than killing people for their body parts. Ed would confess to wearing human faces as skin masks and a mammary vest that he had created from the breasts of his victims. the public were confused as to whether Ed was truly insane or a cunning manipulator of the truth. Throughout his interrogation, he remained the meek, mild little man who never used bad language, was polite and well-mannered at all times, and was generally pleasant and helpful, all whilst confessing to a string of unbelievable perversions. Gein eventually admitted to the murders of Mary Hogan and Bernice Warden, and was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of armed robbery. Ed seemed to be enjoying the attention, the press reported. He would smile broadly for the waiting press as he was escorted to and from his jail cell. Some even speculated that Ed had unburdened his mind, so was now comfortable and happy with himself. Ed's attorney, William Belter, informed the court that Gein would be pleading not guilty by reason of insanity. The residents of Plainfield now had to come to terms with the fact that Gein had robbed the graves of their dead loved ones, their mothers, daughters and sisters, their bodies mutilated and ravaged in such depravity, in the most perverted way. They had to know that their family members had been preserved as Gein's macabre decor, and this thought was unthinkable. The townsfolk demanded to know whose bodies exactly had been taken. So, Gein happily offered authorities a list of names and dates of the graves that he desecrated. 2 of these graves, authorities would decide, would be exhumed to check the veracity of Ed's claims. 52-year-old Eleanor Adams, whose grave was right next to Ed's parents, Augusta and George. It was speculated that the second grave was Ed's own mother, although this was denied by authorities at the time. Adams had died on August 29, 1951, and Gein had admitted to exhuming her body shortly after her burial. As the grave diggers dug down, it was immediately apparent that the grave had been disturbed. When the casket was opened, it was empty, apart from a 12-inch crowbar. The next grave to be opened was Mabel Everson, who died aged 69 on April 15, 1951. Less than 2 feet down, the gravediggers discovered a scattering of human bones. It was all that was left of Mabel Everson. Her casket, too, was empty. These 2 exhumations were enough to verify that Ed was telling the truth about his confessions of grave robbing. In a further development, the ever-helpful Ed agreed to show an officer where the rest of the remains of Mary Hogan were. He accompanied the officer back to his farm and directed him to an ash heap, where he explained that he had cut Mary up and cremated her on his pot-bellied stove, then tossed her remains on his ash heap. Later, another woman's body would be discovered in a garbage trench on Gein's land. When questioned, Gein denied any sexual activity with the corpses, claiming they smelled too bad, and in fact, Gein admitted that he had never had a sexual relationship with a man or a woman in his entire life. Despite speculation that he could not have dug up all the graves on his own, he insisted that he had. I mean, in all actuality, what would the odds of more than one person having the same proclivities as Ed in the same location at the same time be? Gein denied that he had any involvement in the disappearance of Evelyn Hartley, Georgia Weckler, and the 2 hunters on the property next door to his farm. However, it is commonly believed that he was responsible for these murders as well. It remains a curiosity why he wasn't able to confess to these crimes whilst freely discussing all of his other atrocities. Ed was moved to Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, where he underwent vigorous testing and was considered to be physically in good shape, although he frequently complained of headaches and nausea and a constant bad smell of what he described as rotting flesh. His mental state, however, was a more complex issue. He was diagnosed as having a schizophrenic personality with neurotic manifestations and the inability to look at situations realistically. After extensive testing, it was concluded that Ed Gein was indeed clinically insane. Family members of Ed's victims believed and were concerned that he would escape punishment if he was ruled insane at his trial. Thus, Ed remained at Central State Hospital until his insanity hearing on November the 21st, 1957. The courtroom was packed. Gein was declared too insane to stand trial, and he was recommitted to Central State Hospital indefinitely. The town of Plainfield would never be the same again, with press, sightseers, and morbid tourists flocking to the area to catch a glimpse of Gein's farm of horror and the cemeteries which he ransacked. Gein's possessions were set to go to auction on March 30th, 1958, and people flocked to view the items here too. Gein was an infamous national celebrity, and the public were fascinated by his bizarre and macabre crimes. But on March 20th, 1958, 10 days before the auction was set to take place, Gein's farm was burned to the ground. Arson was suspected, but it was never proven nor properly investigated. The town was simply glad to see the back of the farm and hoped that it would deter visitors to their once quiet little hamlet. Fun fact, Ed's car was purchased by sideshow exhibitor Bunny Gibson, who turned the car into a macabre exhibition, charging 25 cents to view it on its first showing. More than 2,000 people decided to pay to look. I must admit, I'm guilty of this type of tourism, having visited the Museum of Death in Los Angeles, the Haunted Museum in Las Vegas, the Dearly Departed Museum in LA, the Jack the Ripper Museum in London, and many, many more around the world. With Ed safely locked away, he became a local legend and was the subject of many jokes and scary stories. In 1960, men working near Gein's farm noticed that dogs were digging at a patch of land. After they went to investigate, they dug up a pile of human bones including ribs, arms, legs, and a pelvis. These remains were quietly reburied in 1962, along with the remains from the original discovery. Gein, for the most part, adapted well to his new life in Central State Hospital. He spent his days here reading and doing odd jobs around the hospital. He was considered a model patient. He was one of the few at the hospital that did not require drugs to keep his mental health issues under control. And during his time at the hospital, Ed did not receive a single visitor. In 1968, after 10 years in psychiatric care, psychiatrists deemed that Gein had recovered enough to stand trial for his crimes. So in January 1968, Gein appeared in public for the first time in more than 10 years and attended preliminary proceedings leading to his trial. The trial was set for November and lasted just a single week, in which several witnesses gave evidence and Gein himself took the stand. When questioned, he maintained that Mrs. Warden was shot by accident and that he couldn't remember what happened after that. He claimed that the sight of her blood caused him to black out and everything was hazy from then on. He also said he couldn't remember butchering Mrs. Warden's body and hanging it on a hook. Ed was quickly found guilty of the first-degree murder of Mrs. Warden. However, he was declared insane at the time of the murder, so was deemed not guilty by reason of insanity. He was convicted and acquitted on the same day and sent back to Central State Hospital for another undefined period of time. Gein told press after his trial that he blamed his actions on the place that he lived and the people who lived there. If the locals, he said, had been friendlier to him, he wouldn't have acted the way that he did. In a surprise move in 1974, Gein filed a petition to be freed, claiming that he had now fully recovered and that there was no reason for him to be in hospital. So on June 27, 1974, he attended a hearing in a bid to be released back into society. Gein was still deemed to be a threat to society, however, and his bid for freedom had failed. He was returned to Central State Hospital to live out the rest of his life in care. He stayed there until 1978, where he was moved to Mendota Mental Health Institute. By this time he was 72 years old and his health was failing. He lived another 6 years, before finally succumbing to cancer and respiratory failure on July the 26th, 1984, at the age of 77. Sheriff Arthur Schley died of heart failure at the age of 43. His family stated after he passed that he was so traumatized by what he had seen in Ed's home and the stress of interviewing him that his health deteriorated shortly after and led to his early death. Good night, everyone.